Row 13. This is business class, not a charity seat. The flight attendant frowned as she eyed Rachel Monroe's worn-out clothes and checked her ticket. A wealthy passenger behind whispered, probably upgraded from a humanitarian fare. That backpack and those shoes say it all. Rachel didn't respond. She simply sat down in seat 13A, pulled her seatbelt across in a strange diagonal fashion, and closed her eyes. No one knew that just minutes later, the very woman they looked down on would be the reason the aircraft didn't break apart at 32,000 feet. Rachel's fingers rested lightly on the frayed straps of her old fabric backpack, the kind that looked like it had been dragged through a dozen countries. Her khaki jacket was faded, the cuffs slightly worn, and her sneakers had a tear at the heel that she hadn't bothered to fix. The cabin of the Frankfurt to New York flight buzzed with the self-important hum of business-class passengers settling in. A man in a sharp navy suit 2 rows ahead was already on his phone, his voice cutting through the air as he argued about stock options. A woman with perfectly styled blonde curls and a diamond bracelet that caught the light leaned toward her companion, her voice low, but not low enough. "She doesn't belong here," she said, her eyes flicking to Rachel's torn shoes. Probably some kind of charity case. Her companion, a guy with slicked back hair and a Rolex, smirked and adjusted his tie. Rachel's hand stayed still, but her thumb pressed briefly against a loose stitch on her bag, a small, controlled movement. She didn't look up. The weight of their stares pressed against her, but she sat like she was used to it, her face calm, her breathing steady. The flight attendant, a woman with a tight bun and a name tag that read, Karen, came back, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. "Miss, I need to see your ticket again," she said, her tone sharp like Rachel was a puzzle she didn't want to solve. Rachel opened her eyes, reached into her jacket pocket, and pulled out the crumpled boarding pass. She handed it over without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. Karen scanned it, her lips pursing as she looked from the ticket to Rachel's plain trousers, then back again. "This is correct," she said, finally, her voice tinged with reluctance. "But you're sure you're in the right cabin?" A guy in a polo shirt a few seats over snorted loud enough to draw eyes. "Bet she's got a sob story for that seat," he said to his buddy who was scrolling on a tablet. "Probably begged her way up here." Karen lingered, her eyes narrowing like she was waiting for Rachel to crack to spill some excuse. But Rachel just leaned her head against the window, her dark, slightly wavy hair falling across her cheek, shutting out the noise. A woman in a tailored blazer, her nails painted a glossy red, leaned across the aisle, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Sweetie, are you lost? This isn't economy. They're very strict about seating here." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cuts. The man next to her, flipping through a financial magazine, didn't look up, but chuckled under his breath. Rachel's fingers paused on her backpack, her eyes flicking to the woman for a moment. She didn't speak, just adjusted her seatbelt, pulling it tighter across her chest in that odd diagonal way. The woman's smile faltered and she turned to her companion, muttering, "Some people just don't know their place." Rachel's jaw tightened just a fraction, but she tilted her head toward the window, watching the ground crew below as the plane prepared to move. The cabin lights glinted off the woman's nails, and the air felt heavier, like everyone was waiting for Rachel to break. "Hey, real quick, before we go on, can you do me a favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep telling stories like this. Stories that hit you right in the chest and remind you what it means to keep going." All right, let's dive back in. The plane taxied, the engines roaring as it lifted off from Frankfurt. Rachel's eyes flickered open, scanning the ceiling of the cabin. She counted 6 spots, pressure points maybe where the metal met the panels. Her gaze lingered, then she closed her eyes again, her fingers brushing the edge of her backpack. The man in the polo shirt, now sipping a whiskey, noticed. "What's she staring at?" he muttered to his buddy, loud enough for the row to hear. "Probably thinks the sky's gonna fall." His buddy laughed, a sharp grating sound that made the woman with the diamond bracelet glance over. "Maybe she's just praying for a miracle," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A few other passengers chuckled, their voices blending into the hum of the engines. Rachel's thumb pressed harder against the stitch on her bag, just for a moment, then relaxed. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane climbed, and the mocking faded into the background, replaced by the clink of glasses and the rustle of expensive coats. A soft beep came from Rachel's bag, so faint it was almost lost in the cabin noise. But the woman with the diamond bracelet? Claire whipped her head around, her eyes wide. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice carrying over the engines. The man in the polo shirt, Richard leaned forward, his face hard. Something just beeped in her bag. What are you monitoring, huh? This is a civilian plane. Karen, the flight attendant, strode over, her expression tight. Miss, I need to inspect your bag. Now, Rachel didn't flinch. She unzipped the backpack, slowly pulling out a small scratched-up device that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. A military-grade wind pressure gauge, its screen flickering faintly. Karen stared, her hands hovering like she didn't know what to do. What is this? She asked, her voice sharp. Rachel's response was quiet, steady. It measures air pressure. You might need it. Karen blinked, then stepped back, clutching the device like it was evidence in a crime. A middle-aged man in a cashmere sweater, his glasses perched on his nose, stood up from his seat, his voice loud and deliberate. Excuse me, but I paid for a safe flight not to sit next to someone with suspicious gadgets. He gestured at Rachel's bag, his glasses slipping slightly as he leaned forward. What kind of person brings that on a plane? Are we supposed to just trust her? A murmur rippled through the cabin heads, nodding in agreement. Rachel's fingers stilled on her backpack, her eyes lifting to meet his. For a moment, she just looked at him, her gaze steady, unblinking. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a small worn notebook, and flipped it open to a blank page. She didn't write anything, just held it there like she was giving him a chance to back down. He didn't. I'm speaking to the captain about this, he said, storming toward the front of the cabin. Rachel closed the notebook, her movements slow, and tucked it back into her bag, her face as calm as ever. The cabin stayed tense, the air thick with suspicion. The man in the Navy suit, a hedge fund manager named Holt, looked up from his phone, his jaw tight. Why does she even have that? Who carries something like that on a plane? His voice was low, but it carried, and heads turned. Rachel didn't answer. She tucked the gauge back into her bag, her fingers brushing against a small faded patch sewn into the fabric, a bird's wing stitched in black thread. The plane leveled off at 32,000 feet, and for a moment everything seemed fine. The flight attendant started serving drinks, and the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. But Rachel's eyes kept drifting to the ceiling like she was hearing something no one else could. Then the plane shook, a violent jolt that sent a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. The cabin lights flickered, and a woman in a silk scarf screamed. Claire clutched her husband's arm, her voice shrill. What's happening? Richard stood up, pointing at Rachel. Things went wrong the second she went near the cockpit. A young guy in an expensive hoodie, Ethan, joined in. She caused it. I saw her messing with that device. The accusations flew, each one sharper than the last. Rachel sat still, her eyes fixed on the ventilation grills above. The plane shuddered again, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. This is your captain. We're experiencing a minor issue. Please remain seated. But the panic was spreading, a wildfire fed by fear and blame. A young woman with a designer purse and a sharp bob haircut stood up, her voice trembling with indignation. I knew something was off about her, she said, pointing at Rachel. She's been sitting there like she's hiding something, and now we're all in danger. The woman's purse slipped from her hands, spilling lipsticks and a phone onto the floor, but she didn't stop. Someone do something before she ruins this flight. Rachel's hands paused mid-motion, her fingers hovering over her backpack. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to catch the woman's eye, and said, "You dropped your phone." Her voice was soft, almost too soft, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The woman froze, her face flushing as she scrambled to pick up her things, the cabin watching in awkward silence. Rachel turned back to the window, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tightened briefly on the strap of her bag. Rachel reached for a napkin on her tray table, pulling a pen from her pocket. She started sketching quick, precise lines forming a 3D map of the plane's airflow system. She marked a spot near engine fan 3, circled it, and wrote secondary valve not sealing. Karen, hovering nearby, watched her. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. Rachel handed her the napkin. "If I'm right," she said, her voice low but clear, "the cabin will lose pressure in 6 minutes. Switch to manual override." "Now?" Karen stared at the napkin, then at Rachel, her hands trembling as she backed away toward the cockpit. The passengers around her weren't listening. They were too busy shouting. "She's a terrorist." The woman in the silk scarf yelled. "She knows too much." Holt stood up, his face red. "Tie her hands," he shouted, yanking off his necktie and holding it out like a rope. "Don't let her touch anything else." Ethan nodded, his eyes wild. "She's a spy or something. Look at her. She doesn't belong here." Karen froze, caught between the mob and Rachel's calm, unyielding gaze. Rachel raised her hands slowly, palms up, like she was surrendering. But her face didn't change, not a flicker of fear, not a hint of anger. She just sat there, her eyes locked on Holt, and he hesitated, the tie dangling limply in his hand. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. The cockpit door swung open. The captain, a man with graying hair and a steady stride, stepped out. He walked straight to Rachel's seat, his eyes catching the faint scar on her wrist, a jagged mark shaped like a bird's wing. He stopped, his voice low but firm. "Falcon Echo 3. Rachel gave a small nod, barely perceptible. The captain turned to the cabin, his gaze hard. "From now on, anyone who obstructs her is committing suicide." "Understood." Holt dropped the tie, his face ashen. Claire sank back into her seat, her hands covering her mouth. The cabin went quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. Rachel didn't say a word. She just leaned back in her seat, her hands folding over her backpack again. A businessman in a pinstripe suit who'd been silent until now stood up, his face twisted with frustration. "This is absurd," he said, his voice booming. "We're supposed to believe she's some kind of hero. Look at her, those clothes, that bag. She's playing us." He waved a hand at Rachel, his gold watch glinting under the cabin lights. The passengers around him murmured, some nodding their earlier fear, turning to defiance. Rachel didn't move, but she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded photo. She held it between her fingers, not opening it, just letting it sit there. The businessman faltered, his eyes darting to the photo, then away. "What's that supposed to prove?" he muttered, but his voice was weaker now. Rachel tucked the photo back into her pocket, her movements slow, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for something no one could name. The plane shook again, softer this time, but enough to make hearts race. The captain didn't return to the cockpit. He stood by Rachel, watching as she pulled out the pressure gauge, again checking its readings. Karen came back holding the napkin Rachel had given her. "The co-pilot switched to manual," she whispered. "It's holding for now." Rachel nodded, her eyes still on the gauge. Ethan, the guy in the hoodie, scoffed under his breath. "Look at her," he muttered to his friend. "Like she just survived a war or something." Rachel turned her head, her eyes meeting his. They weren't angry, weren't cold, just deep, like they'd seen things he'd never understand. "War ends," she said quietly, "when the survivor dares to fly again." Ethan froze, his smirk gone, and he looked away, suddenly interested in his phone. The next hour was a slow burn of tension. The cabin stayed quiet, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy. Holt kept glancing at Rachel, his fingers twitching like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Claire whispered to her husband, her voice too low to catch, but her hands were shaking as she clutched her bracelet. Rachel didn't seem to notice. She kept her eyes on the gauge, occasionally glancing at the ceiling, her face unreadable. The plane stayed steady, but every small bump made passengers flinch. Karen came by again, this time with a glass of water for Rachel. "From the captain," she said softly, her earlier suspicion gone. Rachel took the glass, her fingers brushing Karen's for a moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the engines. A flight attendant from the back of the cabin, younger than Karen, with a nervous smile, approached Rachel's seat. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how everyone's been," she said, her hands twisting together. The passengers nearby turned their eyes, narrowing, some with guilt, others with defiance. The young attendant glanced around, then leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "My brother's in the Air Force. He told me about people like you." Rachel's eyes softened for a moment, just a flicker, and she nodded slightly. The attendant stepped back, her face flushed, and hurried away. The cabin seemed to exhale the tension, shifting like a crack in the ice. Rachel adjusted her backpack, her fingers lingering on the birdwing patch, and the passengers around her looked away, suddenly busy with their own things. As the plane began its descent into New York, the tension started to ease. Passengers shifted in their seats, checking their phones, adjusting their watches. But Rachel stayed still, her eyes fixed on the window now, watching the clouds part to reveal the city below. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "We'll be landing shortly. Thanks to quick action, we've resolved the issue. Please prepare for arrival." No one looked at Rachel, but they all knew. Richard, who'd been so loud earlier, stared at his tray table, his whiskey untouched. Claire fiddled with her bracelet, her face flushed. Ethan slouched lower in his seat, his earbuds in, pretending to be asleep. When the plane touched down, the cabin erupted in relieved chatter. People grabbed their bags, eager to get off, to forget the fear. But as the door opened, two men in sharp NATO uniforms stood waiting at the gate. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood at attention, their eyes locked on Rachel. The entire cabin froze watching as she slung her backpack over one shoulder and walked toward the exit. The officers saluted their movements crisp. "Welcome back, aerial warfare engineer Falcon Echo 3. One of them said, his voice clear and steady. "We've awaited your return." Rachel didn't smile, didn't nod. She just tightened her grip on her backpack and stepped past them, her sneakers silent on the jetway. The passengers stayed quiet, their earlier venom gone. Holt fumbled with his phone, his face pale as he scrolled through something, a news article maybe, or a social media post that had just gone viral. Claire stared at her husband, her hands shaking. "Did you know?" she whispered. He shook his head, his cufflinks glinting as he grabbed his bag. Ethan stayed seated, his earbuds still in, but his eyes were wide fixed on the empty seat 13A. Karen stood by the door watching Rachel disappear down the jetway. She clutched the napkin with Rachel's sketch, her fingers tracing the lines like they were a lifeline. A passenger in a linen suit who had been quiet the whole flight stood up as Rachel passed. He reached out not to stop her, but to hand her a small folded note. "You saved us," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. Rachel paused, her hand hovering over the note before taking it. She didn't open it, just slipped it into her pocket, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. The man nodded, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had lifted. The other passengers watched, some with guilt, others with awe, as Rachel continued down the jetway. The note stayed in her pocket unopened, but her fingers brushed against it as she walked, a small, quiet anchor in the storm of the day. Back in Frankfurt, the airline launched an investigation. Holt, the hedge fund manager, lost his sponsorship deal with a major bank the next day. A video of him shouting at Rachel, accusing her of being a spy, had been posted online by another passenger. It spread fast, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. Claire, the socialite, faced her own fallout. Her whispered comments about Rachel's clothes were caught on someone's phone, and her charity foundation dropped her as their spokesperson. Ethan, the tech startup founder, tried to laugh it off on social media, but his followers weren't having it. His company's stock dipped, and his investors started asking questions. Rachel didn't see any of it. She was already gone, her backpack slung over her shoulder as she walked through JFK, her sneakers scuffing the floor. She didn't turn back, didn't check her phone, didn't care about the whispers that followed her. She'd been through worse than a plane full of cruel strangers. She'd seen wars end, seen planes fall, seen lives saved by a single sketch on a napkin. Her husband was waiting outside, leaning against a black SUV. He didn't say much, just opened the door for her. His presence was enough, the way he stood, the way the air shifted around him. The crowd parted as they walked, not because they knew who he was, but because they felt it. Rachel slid into the car, her backpack at her feet, and the door closed with a soft thud. The city stretched out beyond the tinted windows, a blur of lights and noise. Rachel leaned her head back, her eyes half closed, the weight of the flight settling into her bones. She didn't need to explain herself, didn't need to fight for her place. The truth had done that for her. The scar on her wrist, the bird's wing, caught the light for a moment. She touched it, her fingers steady, and let out a slow breath. The world could judge her all it wanted. She'd keep walking, keep flying, keep saving lives in silence. And somewhere in the quiet of her heart, she knew they'd never break her. But the story didn't start on that plane. Years ago, Rachel had been a girl in a small town, raised in a family so powerful it cast a shadow over everything she did. Her father was a name people whispered, a man who moved money and influence like pieces on a chessboard. Her mother taught her discipline, how to carry herself with restraint, how to let actions speak louder than words. They dressed her in plain clothes, not to hide their wealth, but to teach her humility. "The world will judge you," her mother used to say, brushing Rachel's hair. "Let them. Your strength is in what you do, not what they see." Rachel learned early to keep her head down, to move quietly, to let the noise of the world pass her by. She was 18 when she first saw a plane crash. Not in person, but on a screen in her father's office, a grainy video of a military jet spiraling into the desert. Her father was on the phone, his voice low, talking about pressure valves and faulty designs. Rachel watched the footage over and over, her eyes catching details no one else saw. A flicker in the engine's exhaust, a shift in the wing's angle. She sketched it out on a piece of paper, her hands shaking, and showed it to her father. He didn't smile, didn't praise her. He just took the paper and made a call. A week later, she was enrolled in a classified program training to become an aerial warfare engineer. They called her Falcon Echo 3. She was 19. The training was brutal. Late nights in hangars, her hands greasy from engine parts, her eyes burning from staring at schematics. She learned to read airflow like a language to hear a plane's heartbeat in its hum. She learned to stay calm when everything else was falling apart. And she learned what it meant to be invisible. Her classmates, all men, mocked her at first. Her plain clothes, her quiet voice, her refusal to fight back. But when a test flight went wrong, when a pressure valve failed at 20,000 feet, it was Rachel who climbed into the simulator and brought it down safely. The room went quiet that day too. She didn't gloat. She just walked away, her sneakers scuffing the floor. The scar on her wrist came later on a mission she never talked about. A desert airstrip. A plane that wasn't supposed to be there a moment when everything went wrong. She'd pulled a pilot out of the wreckage, her hands burned, and bleeding, the metal tearing into her skin. The bird's wing scar was a reminder not of the pain, but of the life she'd saved. She didn't talk about it, didn't wear it like a badge, but it was there, a quiet truth etched into her skin. Back on the plane, as the passengers whispered and stared, Rachel's mind didn't drift to those days. She didn't need to remember them. They were in her hands, in the way she held the pressure gauge, in the way her eyes scanned the ceiling. The cabin was a different kind of battlefield, but she knew how to navigate it. When Holt had raised his necktie, when Claire had whispered her venom, when Ethan had sneered, Rachel didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than their words. She'd faced fire and metal, and the kind of fear that makes your bones ache. Their cruelty was just noise. The captain knew her, or at least knew of her. His eyes had caught the scar, and that was enough. He'd heard the stories. Falcon Echo. 3. The engineer who could hear a plane's failure before it happened. He didn't need to ask questions. He just needed her to do what she did best. When she handed over the napkin, when she pointed out the valve, he didn't hesitate. He trusted her because he'd seen what happened when people didn't. The landing in New York was smooth, the kind of landing you barely feel. The passengers clapped a nervous habit, but their eyes kept darting to Rachel's empty seat. She was already gone, moving through the airport with the same quiet purpose she'd carried onto the plane. The NATO officers didn't follow her. They didn't need to. Their salute was enough a signal to the world that she was more than they could ever understand. The passengers who'd mocked her were left to face their own consequences, not because Rachel demanded it, but because the truth always finds a way. Holt's downfall was quick. The video of him shouting, his face red with rage, spread across social media like wildfire. By the next morning, his sponsorship deal was gone, his name a cautionary tale. Claire's charity foundation issued a statement distancing themselves from her insensitive remarks. Her face was plastered across gossip sites, her diamond bracelet now a symbol of her shame. Ethan's startup took a hit, his investors pulling back as his flippant tweets about the flight backfired. None of them saw it coming, but Rachel didn't need to see it. She didn't care about their apologies, their excuses, their scrambling to save face. She was already moving forward. Her husband was waiting, as he always was. He didn't ask about the flight, didn't need to hear the story. He saw it in her eyes, in the way she carried her backpack, in the way she touched the scar on her wrist. He opened the car door, and she slid inside the city, blurring past them. The world could judge her, mock her, try to tie her hands. It didn't matter. She'd keep walking, keep flying, keep saving lives in silence. Her strength wasn't in her words, but in the way she moved through the world, quiet, unbroken, undeniable. And somewhere in the stillness of that car, Rachel let out a breath she'd been holding. Not because she was free, but because she was home. The scar on her wrist caught the light again, and she didn't cover it. She didn't need to. The world could see it or not. She knew who she was. And that was enough. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.